Stellaria media. Nickname for this plant is snowflakes. This is part 1, and in part 2 I'll be sharing a mnemonic or memory technique to help you commit to memory the most distinguishing characteristics of this plant for identifying purposes. Be sure to watch all of part 1 so that part 2 is understandable. This is a weedy plant. It generally is found laying along the ground, or a term which is referred to in botany as being prostrate. It's a creeping plant, creeps along the ground, grows in generally dense, tangled mats. When foraging for this plant, you want to be sure not to gather plants which it will entangle itself in or among. Notice this stem. It has a line of very fine hairs along one side of the stem. When this stem meets one of the swollen nodes, the fine line will jump to the other side. Here at the top, we notice that the line is here to the right. When it passes this node, it would jump to the left. When it passes the node below that, it would jump again to the right, back and forth. This is a very distinctive characteristic of this particular species of chickweed or snowflakes plant. What we see here represent the seed pods. The flowers are eventually replaced by the seed pods. I'll be sharing more details about these later on in this presentation. This one particular leaf reminds me of a flame. That is where, in the mnemonic coming up in part 2, the leaf shape is referenced by fire. This plant can grow up to 8 inches tall, generally 3 to 8 inches. The top portion of the stems are more erect, where the lower portion of the stems, which also tend to be a lot more branched out, are more prostrate and tend to get tangled up and produce these dense mats which can be up to 16 inches long. The mats, that is. Again, notice the leaves, oval. It's very important to remember, and which is associated with flames, is that it has a pointed tip. These pointed tips distinguish it from some of its non-edible and poisonous lookalikes. This plant actually has 5 petals. The petals are very tiny. They're only 1/8 of an inch across. Each of the 5 petals are very deeply lobed or notched, which make them appear to be a total of 10. But again, there are only 5. The sepals here, the modified leaf-like structure beneath the petals, as you see, is in a star shape. Each of these sepals are lance-shaped. Together, they make a star. There are many different species of this particular plant or genus, which is chickweed. One of the distinguishing characteristics of this particular species is that the sepals are as long or longer than the petals. The seed pods, again, which replace the flowers, are capsule-like. These seed pods hold about 6 individual seeds. This picture shows us an example of how the upper portion of the plant can be more erect than the lower part. In the mnemonic, I make reference to these seed pods. Each stem represents one of your arms, and each seed pod represents one of your hands. Again, that will be detailed in part 2, which will be the mnemonic, the memory technique. The stems have very fine hairs. They are a pale green or burgundy in color. The leaves are opposite of one another. They are not alternating along the stem. More arms and hands. The stems of the flowers and or seed pods are lightly hairy or pubescent. This plant, when cut, does not emit a milky sap. This picture shows us another example of the fine white hairs which grow along one side and switches sides at node or joint intervals. These leaves can be 1/2 to 1 inch long and about 1/4 of an inch across. This is a very tiny plant. I'll be showing you some pictures that give us some perspective here later in this presentation. the top portion or the top surface of these leaves are smooth, where the lower surface of the leaves can be occasionally hairy. Now notice that the flowers, they are produced by themselves or they are produced in small clusters at the tips of the stems. It's alone, alone. Here's a small cluster here. This flower is open. These seed pods are closed. Some are drooping. They can also, these flowers, be produced where the branches meet the stem. The roots are shallow, they're very fibrous, and roots also grow from the nodes or joints of the stems. Concerning the leaves, the lower leaves tend to have stems. The upper leaves tend not to have stems, though this is not a good illustration of that. I believe I have a better illustration coming up later in this presentation. This is the picture giving you some perspective. It's another perspective shot. This gives you, or this shows you where the nickname is derived from. Flowers are a very important part of plant identification. Once you become familiar enough with the plant, or I should say once you graduate from identifying plants by its flowers, then you will become, you'll be able to recognize this plant during other parts of the season when the plants or when the flowers are not in bloom. But you see these small, tiny flowers, which represent the snowflakes. You just might have the snowflakes plant. Burgundy stem, somewhat succulent. The stems are brittle, they're wispy. Only 5 petals, deeply lobed. Now when these seed pods split open, they will have 6 teeth. Youngest to the oldest. These are the seeds inside. 6, sometimes up to 12 seeds. Capsule-like. The stems of these plants are smooth, but again, can occasionally be lightly pubescent. Correction. The hairs are only along one side and changing sides at node intervals. This is a picture of what I would imagine are some of the uppermost leaves, where, as you see, it has no leaf stem, which is typical, and is a distinction of this particular species or of chickweed, whereas others have all the leaves have stems, or all of them do not have stems. All species of chickweed are edible. There's a fine line again. Other than this, it's generally smooth. Stem pale green or burgundy. Leaves opposite. These leaves have stems, which indicate that they are older and closer to the bottom of the plant. Oval, pointed. Another important distinction or feature of this plant is the fact that it has an elastic center core in the stems. Bend the stem, twist or rotate each side opposite of each other, and then separate. Very, very gently separate the two pieces. And if you find that the inner core remains attached, and it is elastic, and likely it will be, then you know you have a chickweed plant. All chickweeds have this feature. This is a picture of one of the tiny seeds. The edible parts of this plant are the stems, the leaves, the roots, and the seeds. To learn how to prepare these parts for eating, visit survivalplantsmemorycourse.com and click on the plant's fact sheet, which is Stellaria media, common name chickweed, nickname snowflakes. This has been part 1, and in part 2 I'll be sharing a mnemonic or memory technique to help you commit to memory the most distinguishing characteristics of this plant for identifying purposes. Thank you for watching.